For most of history, armies fought for land, loyalty, and survival. A soldier residenti was tied to a lord, a city, a dynasty, or a cas. War was brutal, then something changed. Violence, detached from loyalty, fighting became a service, and war, for the first time, could be bought. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Mercenary Revolution didn't arrive with a single battle or treaty. It emerged quietly, almost logically, as economies changed. As money replaced land as the primary unit of power, armies followed. Soldiers stopped fighting because they owed allegiance, and started fighting because they were paid. Once that line was crossed, warfare stopped being an extension of politics and started becoming a business model. To understand why mercenaries appeared, you have to understand what came before them. In medieval Europe, armies were built on feudal obligation. Nobles owed their king a fixed period of military service each year. Peasants were levied temporarily, often with many. These forces were unreliable, seasonal, and deeply inefficient. They worked for small, localized conflicts, but they broke down as states grew larger, richer, and more ambitious. By the late Middle Ages, rulers faced wars were lasting longer, cities were wealthier, trade routes needed protection, borders needed permanent defense, and feudal levies simply weren't enough. Loyalty was limited, service expired, and enthusiasm for dying in someone else's dynastic dispute was never particularly strong to begin with. Money offered a solution. As cash economies expanded, rulers realized they could hire soldiers directly. Payment solved several problems at once. Mercenaries were professional. They trained year-round. They could be deployed quickly. They didn't disappear after harvest season, and most importantly, they fought because it was a higher job, not because they believed, but because they were compensated. This wasn't a moral shift. It was a logistical one. Mercenaries emerged, not because kings became corrupt, but because states became complex. Administration required predictability. War demanded reliability, and reliability in a cash economy came with a price tag. Nowhere did this transformation become clearer than in Italian city-states of the 14th and 15th centuries. Florence, Venice, Milan, and others were wealthy, commercially advanced, and politically fragile. They had money, but not manpower. Their citizens were merchants, bankers, and artisans, not eager infantry. So they outsourced violence. Enter the Condottieri. Condottieri were mercenary commanders who ran private armies. Like businesses, they negotiated contracts known as condot, specified payment, duration of service troop numbers, and have acceptable levels of risk. These weren't reckless warlords. They were cautious and treacherous. Their armies were assets. Losing soldiers meant losing future income. As a result, warfare battles became less decisive. Engagements were calculated. Segis replaced open slaughter. Commanders avoided unnecessary bloodshed, not out of financial logic. An intact army was more valuable than a heroic victory. A living soldier could have rented. Again, a dead one could not. This is one of the great ironies of the mercenary era. Professional soldiers often fought less destructively than feudal levies, but for far more, war wasn't about honor. It was about preserving capital. Human capital. But this professionalism can meet a cost. Loyalty became flexible. If payments stopped, service stopped. If a better offer appeared, elite. Some courtiers famously changed sides. Others extended wars deliberately, knowing prolonged instability increased demand for their service. Once violence was commodified, incentives followed the money. And this is the core of the Mercenary Revolution. States lost their monopoly on force. When armies belonged to rulers, power was centralized. When armies belonged to contracts, power fragmented. Military strength no longer depended solely on legitimacy or loyalty. It depended on revenue. Whoever could pay could fight. Whoever couldn't, lost. Regardless of how righteous their cause might have been, gold became more important than crowns. The shift didn't just affect battlefield outcomes. It reshaped politics. Rulers had to prioritize taxation and borrowing to maintain military capacity. Wars became exercises in financial and victory went not to the best, but to the best funded. And states that failed to manage their finances found themselves defenseless, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked cash. Mercenaries changed the relationship between violence and morality. A soldier fighting for homeland might hesitate for turning on civilians. A soldier fighting for pay answers to a contract, not a conscience. Disciplined replaced ideology. Obedience replaced belief. Atrocities didn't happen because our mercenaries were inherently cruel, but because their incentives were. Once violence is reduced to a civis, restraint must be and enforcement costs money. There's a quiet line that runs through this entire transformation. When loyalty has a price, it also has a receipt. The Mercenary Revolution didn't eliminate loyalty, it priced it. And once loyalty could be bought, it could be undercut. This created a feedback loop. States raised more revenue to outbid rivals. Taxes increased, debt expanded. Financial systems became inseparable from military power. War was no longer just a matter of strategy. It was a matter of solvency. By the early modern period, rulers understood that Dangorthy had unleashed armies that could be hired, could also be turned. Power that depended on payment could evaporate overnight. So, states responded the only way they knew how, by absorbing the mercenary model into the state itself. Standing armies were born not out of idealism, but out of fear. Kings centralized recruitment, standardized pay, and imposed uniforms not to restore honor, but to control incentives. Soldiers became permanent employees. Loyalty was no longer negotiated contract by contract. It was enforced through bureaucracy, discipline, and regular wages. On paper, the mercenary era was over. In reality, it had simply been nationalized. The logic remained unchanged. Soldiers still fought because they were paid. The difference was who signed the checks. This shift locked governments into a permanent financial obligation. Standing armies required continuous funding in peacetime and war alike. Taxes had to rise. Borrowing became routine. Entire financial systems were redesigned to sustain military payrolls. The modern state didn't just emerge alongside permanent armies. It was built to feed them. If there were a gold medal for financial denial, policymakers would still be on the podium. Because once violence depends on cash flow, war becomes an accounting problem before it becomes a strategic one. States no longer asked, "Is this war just?" They asked, "Can we afford it?" And that question reshaped everything from taxation to central banking. The 17th and 18th centuries turned warfare into a contest of balance sheets. Britain didn't dominate Europe because it fielded the largest armies. It dominated because it built the most sophisticated financial system, long-term government debt, centralized taxation, reliable credit markets. These weren't economic luxuries. They were military necessities. France learned the lesson the hard way. Lavish spending on armies without matching financial reform helped push the monarchy toward bankruptcy. By 1789, the crown still had soldiers, but no Salvini. The French Revolution wasn't triggered by ideology alone. It was triggered by an exhausted treasury. Money didn't just fund war. It decided who survived it. And this is where the mercenary logic resurfaces quietly in the modern world. The 20th century pretended to bury mercenaries under nationalism and mass conscription. Citizens fought for flags, not paychecks, at least rhetorically. But even then, the economic machinery never stopped running. Soldiers were still compensated. Contractors still supplied weapons. Industries still profited. War was framed as duty, but operated as enterprise. Then toward the end of the century, the masks slipped. Private military companies reappeared, not as rogue bands, but as corporate entities. They offered security, logistics, training, and combat services. Governments hired them to reduce political risk, sidestep troop limits, and outsource accountability. These weren't medieval condottieri with swords. They were firms with legal teams, invoices, and shareholder interests. The Mercenary Revolution hadn't returned. It had evolved. Today, violence is once again a service. It's packaged, regulated, and branded. Contracts specify scope. Liability is managed. Casualties are reclassified, and responsibility becomes diffuse. When something goes wrong, it's rarely clear who is accountable: the state, the contractor, or the market that made it possible. Nothing says stable system like needing a third-party firm to fight wars you and politically afford to fight yourself. The deeper truth is harder to confront. Once violence becomes modular, deployable, billable, deniable, it lowers the threshold for conflict. Leaders face fewer domestic consequences. Wars become easier to start and harder to end. Not because people crave violence, but because systems no longer resist it. This is the same pattern that defined the mercenary age. When armies were expensive but disposable, wars multiplied. When loyalty was transactional, instability became profitable. When soldiers were assets, peace was bad for business. And the economics don't stop at the battlefield. Modern conflicts distort markets in familiar ways. Defense spending balloons. Inflation follows. Debt expands. Entire regions become dependent on security contracts. Reconstruction becomes another revenue stream. War feeds on itself, not because it's irrational, but because it's financially integrated. Those who pay least suffer most. Civilians absorb the cost through taxes, inflation, and lost opportunity. Those with capital hedge, those with contracts profit. The system rewards distance from consequence, just as it always has. Strip away the uniforms, the flags, and the rhetoric, and the mercenary equation remains brutally simple. Whoever controls the money controls the violence. Whoever controls the violence shapes the system. This isn't an argument about morality. It's an argument about incentives. The Mercenary Revolution teaches a lesson that still applies today. When force is for sale, ethics become optional. Stability depends not on virtue, but on oversight. And oversight costs money, which means the system polices itself only as long as it's affordable. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same. The moment the army stopped fighting for kings and started fighting for gold, war stopped being an exception and became a feature. Not because humanity changed, but because the math did. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.